Thank you all for attending. It's great to see so many familiar faces and some new names here. This is the Tufts Judicial Series program featuring Magistrate Judge Steven Locke. We are so honored to have you, Judge Locke, join us today. And we have two fabulous co-moderators, Becky Goldberg and Marc Sittenreich. The TLA started this program because we wanted to feature some of our, judicial members. So to be a TLA member, you have to graduate from Tufts and graduate from law school. It's a free membership. We're a nonprofit. We've been around since 2003. And we're working hard to create and develop our community of Tufts lawyers throughout the country. So we thought that the Tufts Judicial Series is a great way to connect our members, to build our network around the country. And we're excited to do this with a New York judge today. So besides having a national board, Tufts Lawyers Association also has regional committees. We have one in New England where Tufts is based. We have one out in California, West Coast. We have one in DC. And we have a very, very, very active one, the superstar regional group of the TLA in New York. And that is by no part or by every part because of Tricia and her co-chair, Joe, who couldn't be on this call. He's doing a trial prep. But Tricia, if you want to just introduce yourself and say what the New York TLA group is up to, and if they want to get involved, how to do so.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Judge Locke, welcome. I'm happy to have you. I hope you, everyone enjoys the program this evening. So my name is Tricia Pesso. I am a Tufts grad from class of '96, and I'm also a lawyer and co-chair of the New York chapter of TLA. Essentially, we meet once a month, the second Monday of every month at 5 o'clock. And we talk about events that we want to host, events that are pertinent in society or in the legal profession, and really brainstorm and plan and assign responsibilities for getting the events out to keep our TLA membership engaged. We're always looking for volunteers, always looking for people to suggest ideas for events, help to plan events, join the steering committee, and just provide fresh perspectives, and always looking for people to take a leadership role in the organization. TLA is a great organization and really helps to expand your network and kind of make new friends and reconnect with old ones. So if you are interested in learning more about TLA or the New York chapter, definitely feel free to reach out to me. Amy just placed my email address in the chat, and I will get the attendee list from tonight, and you'll be getting an email invitation from us. Look forward to seeing some of you on the calls, and hopefully once we return to in-person events, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that will be later this year. Hope to see some of you in person.
That's great, Tricia. Thank you. And we have some other, we have Stephen Feldman, who's a vice president of the TLA, active New York member, and some other really active members from the TLA. I'm the president of the Tufts Lawyers Association. We have Dan Valentine, who's also a board member on this call. And feel free to reach out to me if you want to learn more about TLA. We're going to be doing active planning starting soon for the fall. So if you have a program idea or want to get involved, reach out to me. We do have an event in 3 weeks. It's going to be featuring one of our TLA members who wrote a book about his litigation stories and practice. So check that out. He's a pretty interesting guy, and I think he's going to do a interesting presentation. So introducing our co-moderators, Marc is a senior attorney at Garfunkel Wild, which is a healthcare firm, right, Marc? And he's actively represents hospitals, and you had a discrimination trial in the Eastern District of New York not too long ago. And you used to work at the Healthcare Division of the Federal Trade Commission Bureau of Competition doing antitrust investigations. You're a 2007 grad from Tufts, and seems like you are pretty familiar with the Eastern District of New York. You've appeared before Judge Locke before, so that's great to have your experience on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Becky Goldberg is just a recent graduate, so congratulations there, Becky. She is a Tufts alumni from 2015. She at Columbia Law School was the notes editor for the Columbia Human Rights Law Review. And I think this is her first week of studying for the bar exam, or maybe a couple of days extra. So good luck on that, Becky. And after she finishes and passes the bar exam, she's going to be clerking for a Judge Kimball Wood of the Southern District of New York for 1 year. And then after that, you're going to be clerking with Judge Michael Garcia of the New York State Court of Appeals. So it sounds like you have a great road ahead of you already, Becky. Congratulations.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
And our featured guest, Judge Locke, he is a Tufts alum from 1989, got his master's in 1990. He is the magistrate judge for the Eastern District of New York. He got his Juris Doctorate at Hofstra University School of Law. He at Tufts focused on economics and did so in practice for, I think, a couple of few years after that, from our call you told us the other day. He was a law clerk for United States District Court Judge Arthur Spat of the Eastern District of New York from 95 to 97. And after that, practiced employment and labor law. I think throughout most of your careers, as well as litigation, you were in a firm for a while, but then you created your own law firm and then joined the bench. So we are so honored to have you, Judge Locke, and thank you, Becky, and thank you, Mark. This is going to be a really informal question and answer by Becky and Mark. If you have any questions for Judge Locke, you can put them in the chat room and I'll ask the question during the program. And we'll have some time for group questioning at the end. So thank you all.
Great. So let's start it off with the most general question we could, Judge Locke. From jumbo to federal magistrate, would you mind telling us a bit about your career path, just to open it up? What drew you to the law?
The more I think about it, the more it was a reasonably direct line, in the sense that I grew up at what I would characterize as the tail end of the civil rights movement that you read about from the 60s. I grew up in the 1970s and early 80s. The public school system that I attended was, I think, the first forced integration order in the North, actually, in New Rochelle, New York. And so issues involving race and civil rights and friction were always visible to me, even as a school child. As I went through school and I got older, obviously I went to Tufts, and there, one of the things I liked about Tufts was there were a lot of avenues for independent research. And so I wound up being a research assistant to the school's labor economist, who was Linda Datcher-Laurie, who has since passed away. And I did a lot more work in that area. Now, I come from a family of lawyers, so there was no way I was going to go to law school. And at one point, I had an offer for a summer job, which normally would turn into a regular job, to work in the Pentagon, doing economic assessments of Army bases all over the world. And the more I thought about it, the more I had to be honest and realize, A, my statistics are incredibly poor, and I barely knew how to use a computer. So I'd be found out pretty quickly, which left me sort of thinking about, well, what am I going to do here? And then law school, as a result of my work at Tufts as a research assistant, and I wrote a thesis, law school seemed like a logical option. And there were only two schools. I didn't know what a journal was, but there were only two schools with journals about labor and employment law. One was at Berkeley. There's no way I was getting into Berkeley. And the other was Hofstra. And so that became the logical destination for me. And I did a lot more work there, knowing I wanted to be an employment lawyer. So I came in with an idea of what I wanted to do, which is at least was unusual then. From there, I graduated. I started working in Chicago at a labor and employment law firm, came back to a clerkship and have been in New York. And with the exception of my clerkship, I've been practicing labor and employment law ever since. But serving as a law clerk to me was probably the most formative experience of my career. And though I wouldn't admit it to myself for more than a decade, I knew I wanted to be a judge. And my judge encouraged me a lot. And it helps to have a mentor like that. And with his encouragement, I eventually applied to become a magistrate judge. And, you know, I tell people I retired on August 14th, 2014, the day I took the bench, because it takes a lot of time, but it doesn't feel like work at all. And that's how I'm here.
So Judge, shifting gears a little, can you tell us about the process for becoming a federal magistrate judge?
Yeah, it's complicated, and most people don't know what it is. And this question usually leads into what exactly is a federal magistrate judge. You learn in your government class, and I didn't have a government class in high school, but my daughters do, about, you know, at least as a matter of the Constitution, the president appoints federal judges and the Senate confirms them. It's not entirely accurate, though, as a practical matter in the trial court. Typically, the senior senator from whatever state appoints, sort of de facto appoints the district judges. I'll focus on that. And then the president sort of signs off, and then the Senate would confirm the district judge. The problem is that's a very political process, and people can get stuck in that process for years, and sometimes stuck in that process for years only to be turned away. But the business of the courts has to continue. So the Federal Magistrate Act was enacted. And what it does is it creates the statutory ability for the Board of Judges, which is a technical matter, are all the active district judges within a district. There are 94 judicial districts. How each district operates is up to itself. And in the Eastern District of New York, the senior judges are incredibly active, and really they form the backbone and the personality of the court in many, if not most ways. What happens is the chief judge appoints what's called a merit selection panel, and I think that's consistent across all the judicial districts. It's about 20 lawyers and non-lawyers. I've seen the number as high as 25. There's a public notice to apply to become a magistrate judge. The application is extremely lengthy. And they sort of cull out who they want to vet some more and then ultimately interview. They condense the list to a day or two of interviews, and they pass on 5 candidates to the Board of Judges. And from those 5, it's one of these 20-on-1 interview processes, first with the merit selection panel, then all the judges at once. And they just sort of bombard you with questions for a half hour or so. And then ultimately they pick only one if there's one opening, or they'll pick as many judges as they need to have slots to fill. But it's a very involved process, but that's basically it. In terms of anticipating the next question, and I don't want to babble too much, but the division of labor between district judges and magistrate judges varies wildly from district to district. And I mean wildly. I think Judge Atlas said that in Texas, where she's based, she had a magistrate judge that was assigned to her, or perhaps, I know in Philadelphia, it can be 1 magistrate judge to 3 district judges. The Eastern District of New York is completely different. Every case is assigned a district judge and a magistrate judge from the beginning. The magistrate judge presides or most of the pretrial proceedings in civil matters, and then has a variety of criminal responsibilities too. So we handle the cases largely on the day-to-day, meaning throughout the discovery process, up until summary judgment, which for the new lawyers would be motions that are filed in almost every civil case to dismiss a case before trial. And then they go to trial before the district judge. There are exceptions to that where I wind up trying cases and handling summary judgment and everything else too. But because of this dual assignment, the magistrate judges are very busy. I find it very gratifying because I touch so many cases and every day is new. I found practicing labor and employment law, the better I got at it, the less interesting it became, over 20 years, it's a long time. And so that's what we do. With respect to the criminal calendar, however many magistrate judges you have, every week, a different magistrate judge is on duty, and you handle all the pre-indictment proceedings, search warrants. We handle a bunch of different hearings, motions to suppress, something called Fatico hearings, which are mini trials related to sentencing in federal court. So if there's an issue about how long a defendant should be sentenced, you might need a hearing to resolve certain specific facts. I've done those. And so it's extremely varied in terms of responsibility. And I'm grateful, A, to work with all the different district judges in the district. There are quite a few. And that cross-pollination, I think, is very helpful and healthy, frankly, for the district. Everybody has a feel for what everybody else does. And all judges are different. All magistrate judges are different. All district judges are different. Everybody has their own idiosyncrasies. And the more familiar you become with that, the better a judge you are, but also the better lawyer you become, as you'll find throughout your practices. Does that answer it?
Yes, Judge, thank you.
So you predicted not one, not two, but three of our questions.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, that is quite all right. So the third question, which you predicted, and maybe there's a little bit more that you want to touch upon, maybe not, I'll throw two questions your way. So the first, which you kind of answered, is what does your role entail? How does the role differ between civil and criminal cases? And then to follow up on that, we're wondering what area of the law or types of cases interest you the most and how come?
Well, it's funny. There's no specific area. For example, I wouldn't say constitutional law necessarily interests me, but too much of any one thing I don't like. So I have some patent cases which are complicated and very technical, but perhaps not interesting to somebody who's picking up a newspaper and would read about it. I had no experience with the criminal law before I took the bench. So all of that is fascinating. That was my biggest learning curve. We do a ton of employment cases, a ton of civil rights cases. It's always been that way in the Eastern District. But even though there's a lot of similarity between the cases, they're all different. And you find little issues cropping up constantly that have to be dealt with. And no matter how much experience you have as a judge, even the most experienced will tell you there's something new every single day. And we had judges on our bench until recently, well into their 90s, who were coming to work every day, and they would tell you the same thing. There's always something new. There's always a creative lawyer coming up with some argument that nobody's ever heard of. And I when I was a summer intern, I worked for a trial court judge in Brooklyn. Well, the way he treated it, he said, no matter how crazy an argument seems, I have to believe that there's some judge in this country somewhere that's going to buy it. And you have to consider it, right? Because you might be that judge, you don't know. And it's the variety that makes judging so interesting. And I think that's a real distinction from the state trial courts, at least in New York, where you have various, what they call parts. I don't know if anybody here has seen Law and Order with the dun-dun, and then they say part 75. That's a real thing in New York. And the judges in the state courts frequently specialize. I had lunch with a judge where she was just starting out and did nothing but DWI cases over and over. And there are traffic court judges and medical malpractice judges. And even within the criminal court, there are murder judges. And federal court is very, very different that way. You're constantly scrambling from topic to topic, constantly, even within the course of a day. Did that answer the question? You said there were two questions. What was the other one?
I think you touched upon both of them. The second one, what
Okay.
area of the law or type of case interests you the most? But what I really was able to take from what you said is that it's really the variety that is so interesting.
For sure. And I'll add, because a lot of times, at least for Tufts grads, you spend a lot of time talking about civil law, and there are fewer prosecutors, I guess, except for Judge Barat, who was on last month. The criminal area can be a bit opaque if you don't have any haven't spent any time working with it. But the magistrate judges will handle all the general investigation stuff that precedes an indictment. And there's a lot of work that goes into that in terms of search warrant, different kinds of warrants. There are different sort of levels of scrutiny that apply to the different applications from the prosecutors. If you've heard of a pen register, it's not a wiretap on your phone, but it's a way to get information about calls coming in and out. There's a lot of work about that. And now with social media, there are all kinds of new issues that exist in terms of what you can get off Facebook, for example, or Instagram. And then with technology, you get all these issues also that crop up in terms of what you can do to monitor the movements of a car, for example. There was a recent Supreme Court case just on that topic. And adding a level of complication to that, remember, federal judges serve for life. So you've got people in their 90s trying to figure out what a GPS is, where an iPad is a revolution, right, to people who are judges, because it's a great career because the arc is so long, right? I'm probably the oldest person on this phone call and the second youngest judge in my building. And so that creates a certain perspective in terms of the things you have to deal with and how current you have to stay in terms of technology and just topics that crop up in the law, both civilly but also criminally, is super important.
So, Judge, staying on this same topic, I understand you've been on the bench about 7 years now. If you had to distill it down to one specific matter you found the most interesting, and to the extent you can tell us about it, obviously, what would that be?
Well, there's no specific matter that I would say is the most interesting, but you'll learn a lot about the general population. And it's funny, I sit on Long Island. The Eastern District is composed of 2 courthouses. There's one in Brooklyn and there's one in Long Island. And the demographics that surround those 2 courthouses used to be very different, right? Not so much anymore. Long Island, the population in Long Island has exploded over time. If it were a state, it would be the 22nd or 23rd largest state in the country, and that's just 2 counties. There are small cities that have become much larger since I went to law school on Long Island, let's put it that way. And the population has become quite mixed. And some of the more interesting lessons I've learned are, I've presided over proceedings with criminal defendants who've had a long history of interactions with the court. And I see people, how they interact with their lawyers. And it's clear to me that a lot of these people could have been anything, right? Which begs the question, how do they wind up on this path? And when you reflect on that, it ties you down a lot. I mean, it's something to really think about. The other thing that's been interesting to me are, I don't think that many people outright lie in federal court, but I'm always reminded of my 8th grade band instructor who said, if you're going to play wrong, play loud. The people who lie will say absolutely anything. I mean, it's truly mind-boggling. So that's kind of interesting too. That hadn't been my experience in the area of the law I've been practicing, but those are 2 overarching things that are noteworthy. In terms of, I guess, one matter, the one I trended once on Facebook because I ordered Leonardo DiCaprio to sit for a deposition. I don't even know what happened in that case. I don't remember. I think it may have been dismissed, but that was picked up in Vietnam, and then it was big news everywhere. Since then, it's died down.
Fair enough. Thanks, Judge.
So speaking about people lying in court, lying on the stand, are there any interesting ethical issues that have arisen or that you've decided while being a judge?
I would say no in the sense of ethical issues like rules of ethics and canons and that kind of thing that I didn't even have to learn for the bar. I think, Becky, you do. And many people after me had a whole section on that. That didn't exist back in the day. I think I'm very lucky, but I think a lot of judges would, at least in the federal courts, I don't have a lot of interaction with the state courts, would echo the fact that the quality of lawyering in the federal courts, in my opinion, has been extremely high, both in terms, and I mean, there's a variety, but in terms of integrity. I don't get the sense that I'm being lied to a lot. The worst thing that happens, and I can hear myself saying it in the courtroom, is you keep asking the question you want me to ask, not the question I have actually asked. And a certain amount of zealotry that goes on where it's not helpful. And if there's a question about sort of life lessons or what would I tell more junior lawyers, it's that. No case is perfect. If I ask you a question, it's because I want to know the answer. And the first day I took the bench, I won't say the name of the firm, but a huge firm in the city sent 4 lawyers out. And I had a very busy day that day. So the courtroom was packed. So there's a partner and there's 3 associates, and there's a lot of parties in this case. And so everybody's getting a chance. He gets up to speak and he starts his presentation. And I generally start by saying I've read all the papers, which is true. And most of the judges, at least that I work with, everybody's read all the papers. It's rare that that's not the case. So I ask people to add things, if they aren't reflected in their papers, or sometimes they'll find something new on reply and they need to respond to that. All fine. Otherwise, I may have a few questions. So he starts his presentation. I said, same thing, counsel, let me jump in. I just have 2 questions I need you to answer. Here's the first one. Give him the question. And the funny thing about this is I don't remember the question and I don't remember what the case was about, but I remember his face and how he treated the questions. He looked at me and then started his presentation again. From the beginning, he didn't even pick up where he left off. And so I I tried to sort of politely intercede and say, look, I got it. I got it all. There's a lot of people in the courtroom, a lot of lawyers on the case. Just give me the answer to the question. And then he started again and would not answer my question. And it's frustrating. I don't know that it was being disrespectful, but he clearly wasn't able to interact in a courtroom. The reality is I'm just a guy who's trying to figure it out, right? Your case that day is going to be 1 of 20 or 30. You're going to know a lot more about it than I am, right? I only know it was in the papers. And if I'm asking a question, it's for a reason. And it may be that I'm leading you down a path a little bit because I may have thought of something that wasn't reflected in the papers. But there's a reason. We have so many cases, there's no time to waste. So I need the information I'm asking for and then to move on. And look, if I haven't read something, I'll also tell people that. I read the papers, I couldn't go through all the exhibits. Here's what I need to know. But I'm not going to hide the ball about that. And lawyers shouldn't do that either. But that's the exception, by and large, even if the writing isn't that good, lawyers are generally very candid and they're not trying to sort of jockey me with things.
Judge, this is Tom Dunn. We do have a question from the participants, but it's great to hear that you read all the papers. That's a luxury as an attorney to get that. So thank you for spending the time and that effort. So the question is about issues of bail and sentencing, and
oh boy, okay.
And the TLA has done a lot of programming over the past year with racial disparities and implicit bias and those issues. And I wonder if you have any, how you have given any thought of how you deal with implicit bias in sentencing, bail issues when you're dealing with people from different races, classes, cultures than yourself.
Sure. I want to break something down. Magistrate judges handle almost all the bail hearings in our courthouse. Magistrate judges cannot sentence defendants except to misdemeanors, which are rare for the U.S. Attorney's Office. There are misdemeanor cases, and I've done some sentencings, but that's really the exception. So I don't even have a large enough data sample to draw from to answer that component of the question. But I do handle so many bail hearings that I have no idea how many I've handled. What I can tell you are two things. One, the Eastern District of New York, if you look at the background of the bench, is extremely diverse, particularly amongst the active district judges. If you knew when everybody was born or knew all the judges, you would see there's a tier of white men who are more senior. And then there's another tier of judges who are not, as simple as that. So topics like this are frequently discussed. Now, I operate out of the smaller courthouse. It's actually, I think, a bigger building than in Brooklyn. We're the same size, but we have much fewer judges. And so our interactions are much more conversational. We don't need sort of a formal listserv or group emails, although we have that too, district-wide. But we talk about these topics all the time. And it comes up in bail because you'll see racial disparities in terms of what might be offered as a bail package, right? Somebody owns a house or doesn't. I will tell you that in addition to the judges trying to be sensitive to that, and we do, like I said, we talk about it a lot, the U.S. Attorney's Office, I think, has also done a good job of being sensitive about that and recognizes that for some defendant, or two different defendants with similar crimes, for one, they need to put up their house, and for another, $1,000 is sufficient, despite the similarities in the crime, because the way it works, it's helpful when you're a judge to remind yourself of what the question is. And for a bail, it's in the federal court. The state court's different. Risk of flight, or is the person a danger to the community? Bail typically helps with risk of flight, make sure people will come back to court and obey the court's orders. What will do that for defendant A is not the same thing as defendant B. And so you have to really be thoughtful about, you may have done 1,000 bail hearings, but every defendant's going to be a little bit different, both in terms of their motivation, but also in what they react to. So I can tell you we're extremely sensitized to that in the Eastern District of New York.
Judge, following up on that question, you mentioned before that you had limited experience with criminal law before you took the bench. And I think by limited, I think you mean none, right?
Correct.
So this is in addition to being extremely interesting, it's also a very, very complex area of the law, and it's very, sensitive. How did you familiarize yourself with the criminal aspect of your job? And sort of two pieces of that. One, when you were getting that sort of battery in the interview for the magistrate judgeship, were you grilled on, how you would handle criminal matters, and B, was it sort of like drinking from a fire hose when you ultimately took the bench?
Yes to all of that. I mean, it was an obvious question to ask me during an interview process. Now, the reality, I think, is I had to learn all the law. And so, for example, you get something like an application for the pen register, which is how you keep track of numbers of phone called or numbers that were called into a certain phone. That application, you could suggest, is very similar, almost the same every time. I didn't know that. My friends on the bench who had criminal experience said, don't worry about it, it's the same. That's not good enough for me. So I read all the statutes that were cited in there until I familiarized myself with that. And I did that with every proceeding. And then eventually, I can tell you now which statutes are about what, and what goes with what in terms of different areas of the law. But there was a tremendous learning curve, and I was completely freaked out about it, candidly. So I made it my business to get up to speed. I will tell you that in my courthouse, my colleagues I couldn't wish for a better group of people to work with. Everybody shares their expertise. And as you may know now, but if you don't, you will come to realize that the lion's share of federal judges are all former AUSAs, all former assistant United States attorneys. The percentage, it has to be somewhere near 80%. Even with varied backgrounds and personal experiences, they all wound their way through the U.S. Attorney's Office. I did not, and so I lacked that experience. That being said, even with that difference, my colleagues will regularly come to me with questions about employment law, even when they've been on the bench for 10, 15 years, because there are practical aspects to that area that aren't clear from reading the law. And it's not always obvious why a lawyer might be motivated to do something. And I've received group emails where people are complaining about lawyers doing this and filing motions for class certification in wage and hour cases very early. And so I responded and explained there was a Supreme Court case that kind of jammed it up, and here's why they do that, and you need to relax a little. And so everybody said, oh, okay. And they understood. So there's a lot of interaction among the judges in terms of the questions of the day. And an interesting fact that some of you may have seen if you're senior enough, that 5 years ago, there was an article in the New York Times about judges going to other judges for answers to questions. And so you've got the judge not on your case, ruling on your case, and that's terrible. That was a front page article, and it completely misunderstood everything that goes on. And I'll add that being a judge, you learn a lot about the distinction between what's printed in the press, and by printed, I'm using the word very loosely, and what actually happened in the courtroom, because those are not necessarily the same thing. But that was a perfect example of that. Judges are constantly bouncing ideas off each other. And I have colleagues who had, 20 years criminal law experience, and I'll work through ideas with them, and they'll look at me and they'll say, you're not going to do that, are you? And I'll say, no, but it helps me to crystallize my thinking by having that interaction. You cannot get everything from a book, or I guess, in your case, Westlaw, right? There are things you miss. And so that's how we do it.
I'll actually take that a step further. As you were a law clerk, and I was a law clerk, and also Becky will soon be a law clerk, that as a law clerk, you have significant input into the judge's thinking, and, you get to discuss the case with the judge. And, you don't see articles being published that say, these law clerks are deciding your cases. So it's an interesting point.
No. And look, I mean, hopefully you have terrific law clerks, and like everything, that can vary, and different law clerks will have different strengths, different areas they need to work harder on. But to attack the same topics from a different angle, and I say this to every group I speak with, that there are two things, and this is for young lawyers who may be on the call, or more junior lawyers, I should say, age is not so relevant, that there are two forms of currency that will carry you throughout your career. One is being a law clerk. Typically it's to a federal judge or to a state Supreme Court judge. People not from New York, Becky's clerkship in the Court of Appeals is the Supreme Court of the state of New York. We name everything backwards in New York. I have no idea why. But that is both a credential and equally important an experience that is invaluable. And everybody gets that, because when you work in a law firm, you write the same section of the summary judgment motion 75 times. And it ceases to become interesting or useful to you as a lawyer when you're doing that, when you have all this added bureaucracy on top of it. But when I was a law clerk, it's funny, I worked on drafts I asked my judge, I said, how many opinions do you think I've worked on? He said, 50. He had no idea. The answer was 172 and these were 30, 40, 50 longest opinion I helped work on was with the FTC. There was a point in time in the 90s where there was an issue about merging hospitals. And as the market for healthcare go from New York City to the Hamptons, which for those of you not from New York is New York City, that, the Hamptons is the eastern tip of, or Montauk, the eastern tip of Long Island. And the court answered that question. Yeah, people from Long Island will go to New York City. And that the FTC lost that lawsuit. That was in the 1990s. When that was fascinating, right? That sounds like it might antitrust, not for everybody. Fascinating to work on because I knew nothing about it as a law clerk. That's one credential that will carry you everywhere. The other is if you serve time as an assistant United States attorney. And it's important to remember that the United States Attorney's Office has a civil and a criminal division, right? So if you're not a criminal law person necessarily, there is still work for you to do in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Those two credentials are super, super important for career development purposes. So I encourage everybody to explore that. That doesn't even answer your question. That's what politicians do, right? They take your question and they make it what they want it to be, which is what I tell lawyers not to do. Okay.
Adding on to that, and thank you for acknowledging the half currency that I've already have in my wallet, apparently. For the young lawyers who are in the crowd, do you accept clerkship applicants?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's funny. There's been a real evolution of the clerkship application process. When I applied to be a law clerk, we had something called paper and stamps and envelopes, and you had to mail them. And people did crazy things. They put, I remember seeing one application, which was a binder of 8 different papers that somebody wrote with a long explanation. That I wouldn't even read that. For a long time, law clerks, and this must be your experience, Becky, were almost recruited out of law school or during law school. And you left law school and you went to become a law clerk. And there were certain schools that were feeders to higher and higher courts. My wife, who's a Tufts grad, who I believe is on the line, went to the University of Chicago. I graduated law school. I didn't even know what clerking was about. It didn't mean anything to me. But I met her friends and it meant a lot to them. And I thought to myself, light bulb, moment. And the University of Chicago is a real feeder school. There's a competition among judges for their graduates. And I'm sure that's true at Columbia as well. And my brother went to Columbia. I have opinions about that, not because of you. But there was this competition. The judge I clerked for, and I don't know if anybody here is a football fan, but frequently you talk about like a coach and there's junior coaches who go on to become head coaches. And there were these trees, like for Bill Parcells, who used to coach the Giants, and everybody who coached under him, which would include Bill Belichick in New England. Similarly for judges, judges will have law clerks who they hope will go on to become judges. And the influence of your clerkship on the chambers you run is significant. And everybody I know will say that. And if you say, well, why'd you do that? They'll say, well, my judge did it. So that becomes your judge. You have a pet judge. And so my judge, Judge Spat, who only recently just passed away in '93 after 10,000 years on the bench, would hire clerks every other year. He would stagger them, which is what I do. And he required them to have 2 years experience, which is what I do. I think it's important to have lawyers with some experience come into chambers. One thing's for sure, they will appreciate being a law clerk that much more, without question, after spending a few years in a firm. But we move so fast and we have so many cases and the work is extreme at times. I mean, there's just a lot to get through. The Eastern District of New York is one of the busiest in the country. And so they need to develop that skill. And also they need to do some writing before I can evaluate their writing. Me reading someone's law review note is not very helpful in terms of how they write. First of all, that law review note has been edited to death by everybody who thinks they know how to write, whether or not they actually do. And it's not written the way a memo or a legal brief might be written. I value economy of words, and so do judges. But saying I wrote a 150-page note has a different connotation than I wrote a 25-page note, right? And so you're looking for something different in terms of the writing. And so it's easier for me to evaluate people who've got a couple of years under their belt. Plus, if they apply after a couple of years, that tells me they want it, that they're interested in it. Maybe they didn't get it after graduation, or maybe they went to Hofstra like me and haven't thought about it. But so yes, I do. Now there's something called Oscar, like Oscar the Grouch without the grouch. And all the applications are submitted through that. There's a list of criteria that you can enter. I only take people who've worked. You can say, I only want people who've been on a journal and so on for the judges. Despite those, there are people who clearly, there must be a button that says apply to every opening, because I get people who don't match any of my criteria. But it's through that process, you know, I'll say wait after you're out 2 years and people apply. So yes, I do, and that's what I require. But you have to look at what's on Oscar. I'm the exception. I think Judge Atlas last month said, she talked about sort of the race to acquire the law clerks that she went through and to beat out, you know, the circuit court judges to get the same law clerks. And I don't have that experience.
Judge Locke,
Yes.
it's one thing that's come out through these programs, and you heard it during Judge Atlas's program, is the changing of the legal profession, civility, mentorship, ability, as you're talking about younger attorneys or newer attorneys, getting the trial experience, the motion practice, argument experience. Is there anything you do in your practice as a judge to help facilitate, other than the clerkship, you know, the development of attorneys and the legal profession, you know, that appear before you?
It's funny, this is a strange form, right? Tufts is a competitive university that doesn't have a law school. And so you're not, for example, you'll have a ton of Columbia grads who are probably judges in or around New York, right? There's a center of gravity that doesn't exist for Tufts. So listening to these other judges speak has been really helpful to me, because they've clearly thought about things that I haven't. I think it may have been Judge Barat who said, if you tell me that the lawyer has less than 7 years experience, I'll give you oral argument. And that person will argue, and I'll let them in and do that. I may adopt that. That makes sense to me, just to get young people into court. It's interesting because the follow-up question that I didn't ask, because I didn't think it was appropriate, but someone did, was, well, has oral argument ever changed your minds? And this is circling back to reading all the papers. The answer is almost without exception, no. Now, especially in civil cases, when civil cases, everything is briefed up the wazoo, right? There's way more paper than you need. So you know what you're going to do. In criminal cases, things are a lot more fluid and loosey-goosey, and things like bail hearings, there's very rarely briefing. So it's all on the fly. But that's important. What I do is I have interns every summer. I have interns, anybody who applies, I take as an intern. It's funny, there are judges who can take their internships and they treat them like this competition to get the best interns. I am the opposite. I wait till everybody's recruited, all their interns, and I take the other guys and women. And anybody who wants it, they're welcome. So I've had tons of interns some seasons and very few others. And I also take high school interns and college interns, which most judges do not. It's a little hard to keep everybody engaged, although now everybody who's in high school is, you know, Lexis and Westlaw was a huge breakthrough when I was in law school. Google is essentially Lexis and Westlaw for the world, right? On any topic. So it's not hard for people that age to sort of adapt to what they're doing. Is the writing there? No, of course the writing is not there. But what I do is I have the college students mentor the high school students, and the law school students mentor everybody else. And for people who don't know where Central Islip, which is where my courthouse is, it's the middle of nowhere. I mean, quite literally. It's the biggest building, it's the most beautiful building in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And so people, when I've had interns come in from Brooklyn, take the train, I make the law students and the college students pick them up at the train and drive them to chambers and drive them back. Some of I had one law high school student who was starting to get a bit of a big head, didn't anticipate that. And I make them mentor each other. And then I meet with them a couple of times a week. And I try to invest, the importance of clerking, U.S. Attorney's Office, and networking. And I encourage them to stay in touch with each other. With me to a lesser degree, just because I have so many moving parts, but I try to instill that value and mentor people like that, in that fashion, I should say, when I say it like that. Then I'll meet them a couple times a week to go over cases, talk about things they might find interesting. It's hard. The more junior people are, the more freaked out they are when I address them personally. And in fact, I had one intern who was a really good friend of one of my daughters. And she was in chamber, freaked out, completely freaked out in chambers. Not at my house, so I try to sort of make it a little more inviting and not get too close to anyone if I'm sensing that that's what's going to happen. But that's what I do in terms of that. But I think mentorship is important. Anybody who's on this line and done with this, if they want to shoot me an email, I don't know how to put my email in the chat, but someone else can. You should feel free to reach out. If I didn't want to mentor people, I wouldn't do this. I'm in Florida right now.
So Mark and Becky, do you have one last question for the judge before we all go back into kind of a group session?
I think we're good at this point. I think Judge Locke, thank you. You've answered our questions in spades. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Locke and Becky. Mark, thank you very much. We're going to stop the recording now and go to gallery view.